In the waning years of the 16th century, across the fractured landscape of the Kingdom of Hungary, a figure emerged from the highest echelons of nobility, whose name would eventually become synonymous with unfathomable cruelty. This was Elizabeth Báthory, a countess whose sprawling estates and immense influence placed her beyond the reach of conventional justice for decades. She became the subject of accusations so profound they echo into the present day: the systematic torture and murder of hundreds of young women, predominantly her own household servants. Yet, despite the vast number of alleged victims and the severity of the charges, Elizabeth Báthory was never formally convicted of these crimes. She was never made to stand trial in a public court of law, nor was she sentenced to a state-sanctioned execution. The central question is not merely the nature of the horrific acts attributed to her, but the precise mechanisms of power, law, and social standing that allowed a person accused of such extensive atrocities to largely escape the direct legal accountability that would have swiftly condemned any ordinary citizen. This account will unpack the historical records, the societal norms, and the intricate web of influence that shaped her existence and her ultimate fate, revealing how systemic privilege could fundamentally alter the course of justice in early modern Europe. To comprehend the environment that both nurtured and arguably enabled Elizabeth Báthory's alleged conduct, one must first grasp the societal structure into which she was born. Elizabeth entered the world in 1560, a scion of the Báthory family, one of the most distinguished and wealthy noble lineages in the Kingdom of Hungary. This was a period of intense geopolitical flux, with the Hungarian lands perpetually contested between the powerful Habsburg monarchy to the west and the encroaching Ottoman Empire to the east. The Báthory family, however, transcended these conflicts in many respects, commanding vast swathes of territory and wielding immense political sway within the region of Transylvania and throughout Hungary proper. Their pedigree was undeniable, boasting princes, cardinals, and formidable military commanders. This illustrious lineage conferred upon Elizabeth an inherited status that positioned her at the apex of the social hierarchy. From her earliest moments, she was accustomed to an environment of unparalleled affluence, far-reaching political connections, and a degree of personal authority that went virtually unquestioned within her ancestral domains. Her upbringing instilled a deep-seated understanding of her elevated station and the absolute deference she was entitled to receive from anyone beneath her in the rigid feudal order. Elizabeth's early years were shaped by the expectations of her noble birth. She received an education that was notably comprehensive for a woman of her era, acquiring proficiency in Latin, German, and her native Hungarian. This intellectual grounding, however, was in service of her future role as a mistress of a powerful household, not as an academic or public figure. At the age of 15 in 1575, she was married to Ferenc Nádasdy, a prominent Hungarian aristocrat renowned for his military prowess against the Ottoman Turks, a distinction that earned him the moniker the Black Knight of Hungary. This union was not predicated on personal affection but on strategic dynastic alliance, a common practice among the aristocracy to consolidate power, expand landholdings, and reinforce political ties. The marriage thus intertwined Elizabeth with yet another extensive network of influence and resources. Nádasdy's military duties frequently called him away from their estates, particularly during prolonged campaigns on the Ottoman frontier. In his absence, Elizabeth assumed full responsibility for managing their sprawling properties, including the formidable Széchenyi castle. This delegated authority meant she exercised direct, often absolute control over hundreds of serfs, servants, and local administrators. Her command in these matters was largely unmonitored and unquestioned, a situation that provided her with a considerable sphere of autonomous operation. Széchenyi Castle, perched dramatically on a hill in what is now Slovakia, functioned as more than just Elizabeth Báthory's principal residence. It was the strategic and administrative heart of her personal domain, the very nucleus where the alleged atrocities later took place. During her husband Ferenc Nádasdy's protracted absences, which could last for months or even years while he engaged in military campaigns against the Ottoman forces, Elizabeth assumed the mantle of de facto sovereign within her territories. Her responsibilities were expansive. She managed all aspects of their considerable estates, oversaw agricultural production, administered local legal disputes, and collected rents and taxes from the vast peasant populations tied to her lands. In essence, her word was law for thousands of people residing within her purview. This form of absolute authority, deeply embedded within the feudal system of the time, meant that the serfs and household servants under her dominion possessed virtually no legal recourse or protective mechanisms against their powerful mistress. They were bound by custom and law to their lord or lady, with minimal avenues for complaint or appeal outside the noble's direct jurisdiction. This environment, characterized by an almost unchallenged dominion, cultivated a context ripe for the unrestrained exercise of power, a crucial element in the development of the later, severe accusations. While the most severe and public accusations against Elizabeth Báthory emerged during the latter stages of her life, historical records, particularly the testimonies gathered during later investigations, indicate that whispers of her cruelty began much earlier. These early allegations describe a pattern of excessive and disproportionate punishment meted out for minor infractions by her servants. Accounts detail instances of severe beatings, the application of heated objects to the skin, and other forms of physical abuse. These were not isolated bursts of temper, but reportedly a developing, consistent pattern of behavior within her household. What is critical to understand about these initial instances of alleged cruelty is their containment. They remained largely an internal affair of the Báthory and Nádasdy households, not openly challenged by external authorities. The victims, predominantly young, impoverished girls drawn from the surrounding villages, occupied the lowest rung of the social ladder. They possessed no public voice, no means of redress, and no significant legal standing. Local officials, often financially or politically reliant on or intimidated by the formidable Báthory and Nádasdy families, were exceptionally unlikely to intervene in the private disciplinary matters of such powerful nobles. This established a precedent of impunity, reinforcing the Countess's perceived immunity from external scrutiny. Ferenc Nádasdy, Elizabeth Báthory's husband, died in 1604, likely succumbing to an illness contracted during his arduous military service. His passing represented a profound inflection point in Elizabeth's life, and according to historical accounts, coincided with a significant escalation in the alleged atrocities committed at Sacy and her other castles. While Nádasdy himself was a military commander accustomed to the brutal realities of warfare and known for his own ruthlessness, and while historical debate persists regarding his awareness or potential complicity in his wife's earlier, less extreme cruelties, his presence at least constituted a prominent male figure within the family structure. His position, both within the family and the wider Hungarian nobility, provided a certain external representation, and perhaps a subtle, if unspoken, check on Elizabeth's domestic conduct. With Nádasdy's death, Elizabeth became an immensely wealthy widow, gaining effective sole control and administration over the vast Nádasdy estates, in addition to her own inherited properties. This shift dramatically expanded her personal power and removed any potential, however indirect or subtle, restraining influence that her husband's presence might have exerted. The legal and social structures of the time largely deferred to noble widows in the management of their property, providing her with an unparalleled degree of autonomy. Following the death of Ferenc Nádasdy in 1604, the nature and frequency of the alleged abuses attributed to Elizabeth Báthory reportedly intensified dramatically. According to the later testimonies gathered by investigators, the accusations detailed a gruesome array of severe physical maltreatment. These included the infliction of extreme beatings, the insertion of needles under fingernails, the application of hot irons to the skin, and other methods designed to cause profound bodily harm and pain. Some accounts described victims being stripped and left exposed to the elements, or being doused with cold water in winter. The victims of these alleged acts were primarily young girls, often from impoverished local families, who had been recruited into service within the Báthory household. The motivations for these brutal acts, as suggested by witnesses during the investigations, frequently appeared to be exceptionally trivial offences, such as minor mistakes in chores, perceived clumsiness, or even simply the Countess's capricious desire for gratification derived from witnessing the suffering of others. The scale of these alleged actions grew considerably over time, reportedly transitioning from isolated incidents of harsh aristocratic discipline, which itself was common, to a systematic and widespread pattern of abuse that seemed to indicate a deliberate and prolonged campaign of cruelty. The individuals who became the alleged victims of Elizabeth Báthory's escalating cruelty were almost exclusively young, impoverished peasant girls. Many were recruited from the surrounding villages and communities with promises of steady wages, regular meals, and the perceived social advancement that came with service in a noble household. For families struggling with the daily realities of poverty and subsistence farming, sending a daughter to serve in a countess's castle represented a tangible opportunity for economic improvement and, at times, a chance for the girl herself to avoid a life of hardship. However, once within the castle walls, these girls became extraordinarily vulnerable. They were physically isolated from their families and their home communities, entirely dependent on their employer for their livelihood, and even their basic survival. Crucially, they lacked any significant social standing, legal recourse or means of communication with the outside world that was not mediated by the Countess or her inner circle. Consequently, the disappearance or death of these girls within the confines of Széchet or other Báthory castles often went uninvestigated or unreported. Their low social status meant their lives were not deemed of sufficient public importance to warrant official inquiry, and the pervasive fear of the Báthory family's immense power effectively silenced any potential whistleblowers or concerned villagers. The alleged atrocities attributed to Elizabeth Báthory were not carried out in isolation. According to subsequent investigations and numerous testimonies, she had several key individuals within her household who acted as direct accomplices or were deeply complicit in the abuses. Among these were her old governess, Ilona Yo, a woman named Dorothea Countess, who was also known as Dorko and rumoured to be a local witch, and two other servants, Katalin Benikar and Janos Uivari, often referred to by his diminutive name, Fichko. These individuals were accused of actively participating in the tortures, assisting in luring new victims to the castle, and in the gruesome task of disposing of the bodies of those who died. Their involvement sheds light on the complex and deeply disturbing dynamics that must have pervaded the Báthory household. It suggests a combination of unwavering loyalty, possibly born of long service or familial ties, profound fear of the Countess's wrath, and a chilling complicity in the systematic cruelty. Some accounts suggest a warped sense of shared purpose or a perverse camaraderie among these accomplices. The testimonies provided by these individuals, particularly those extracted during their later interrogations, formed a crucial and detailed component of the evidence compiled against the Countess herself. For many years, the horrifying rumours surrounding Elizabeth Báthory's alleged actions remained largely confined to the immediate vicinity of her castles, circulating as hushed whispers among the local peasantry and the terrified domestic staff who managed to escape. These accounts spoke of girls disappearing into the castle and never returning, or of those who did escape bearing horrific injuries. However, as the alleged scale of the Countess's activities grew, and the number of missing young women became increasingly difficult to ignore, these local whispers began to transcend the immediate boundaries of Sajay and her other estates. Reports of mutilated bodies discovered outside the castle walls, often buried secretly or discarded, and the desperate, often traumatized accounts of girls who managed to flee the Countess's service, slowly began to reach ears beyond the peasantry. Priests and local village officials, initially hesitant to challenge a noble of such immense standing, eventually felt compelled to report their growing concerns to higher authorities. These escalating complaints, meticulously compiled over a period of time, finally succeeded in drawing the attention of some of the most powerful figures within the Kingdom of Hungary, most notably the Palatine, György Thurzó, the highest judicial officer in the land. The sheer volume and consistency of the allegations eventually became too significant to dismiss. György Thurzó, holding the esteemed office of Palatine of Hungary, functioned as the kingdom's chief judicial and administrative officer, effectively the monarch's deputy, and was himself a formidable noble with extensive lands and influence. In 1610, confronted with a growing dossier of compelling evidence and direct appeals from concerned local officials, and even the reigning Habsburg Emperor Matthias, Thurzó initiated a formal investigation into the allegations against Elizabeth Báthory. Thurzó's motivations for undertaking such a politically sensitive inquiry were likely multifaceted: a genuine desire to uphold justice, the undeniable pressure emanating from the imperial court in Vienna, which feared the growing scandal and its implications for public order, and potentially an element of political calculation to assert his authority, or that of the crown over an excessively powerful magnate. He dispatched trusted investigators to the Báthory estates, where they systematically gathered sworn testimonies from over 300 witnesses. These witnesses included numerous survivors who had managed to escape the Countess's service, frightened former servants, and villagers who had witnessed suspicious activity or whose daughters had vanished. These meticulously recorded testimonies provided harrowing and detailed accounts of the alleged tortures, the disposal of bodies, and the general reign of terror within the Countess's household. This comprehensive collection of eyewitness statements and compiled evidence represented the critical turning point in transforming widespread rumour into a documented case, providing the foundation for subsequent legal proceedings. On January 7, 1611, a formal inquiry, which functioned as a type of preliminary trial, was convened at Siki Castle itself. Crucially, Elizabeth Báthory was not physically present at these proceedings, nor was she directly tried for murder. The legal and political sensitivities surrounding the direct prosecution of such a high-ranking noble were immense, as a public trial could have destabilized the fragile political order. Instead, the focus of this inquiry was on her four key alleged accomplices: Ilona Yo, Dorothea Countess Dorko, Katalin Benikar, and Janos Uivari Fichko. During their interrogations, which, in accordance with common legal practices of the era for commoners, included the application of torture to extract confessions, these individuals provided detailed accounts of their direct participation in the abuses. More significantly, they explicitly implicated Báthory as the primary instigator and orchestrator of the cruelties. Their testimonies, though obtained under duress, largely corroborated and aligned with the extensive body of witness statements that György Thurzol's investigators had already meticulously compiled. The collective evidence presented during this inquiry painted a horrifying and consistent picture of systematic abuse and murder that had allegedly been carried out over many years within the Countess's domain. The outcome for the accomplices was swift and brutal. Ilona Yor and Dorothea Sentes were sentenced to death by burning for their heinous crimes, a punishment often reserved for witchcraft or particularly severe offences. Fitzgor was beheaded before his body was burned, a slightly less degrading execution but still a severe public condemnation. Cătălin Benicar, whose involvement was deemed somewhat less direct, received a prison sentence, reflecting the varying degrees of culpability assigned by the court. Despite the overwhelming volume of evidence accumulated against her, and the convictions and executions of her direct accomplices, Elizabeth Báthory was never formally subjected to a public trial for murder, nor was she executed by state decree. Her immense aristocratic status proved to be the decisive factor in her distinct fate. To publicly try and execute a member of one of Hungary's most powerful and politically connected families, particularly a widow of the distinguished Ferenc Nádasdy, would have set an unprecedented and potentially destabilizing precedent within the rigid Hungarian social and political hierarchy. Such an act could have alienated other powerful nobles, inviting unrest and challenges to central authority. Instead, a less public, politically expedient solution was engineered. On December 29, 1610, György Thurzol, the Palatine, personally arrested Báthory at Szeged Castle. Rather than being transported to a public gallows or facing the ignominy of a full trial, she was subjected to a form of permanent imprisonment within her own castle. Confined to a suite of rooms within Szeged for the remainder of her life, her windows were reportedly bricked up. This arrangement constituted a de facto house arrest, a carefully calculated legal and political compromise that tacitly acknowledged the severity of the accusations while simultaneously avoiding the public humiliation and potential political fallout of formally prosecuting a noble of her standing. She remained in this constrained existence until her death on August 21, 1614, without ever having been publicly condemned by a court for the murders attributed to her. The historical account of Elizabeth Báthory has, over centuries, significantly evolved from its foundation in documented cruelty into a more sensationalized and often distorted popular legend. The most pervasive and enduring aspect of this myth, one that frequently eclipses the actual historical details, is the claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth and beauty. This specific, highly dramatic detail is notably absent from any of the original testimonies, legal documents or contemporary accounts from the 17th century concerning her case. There is no historical record from the period of the investigation or her imprisonment that mentions bloodbaths as part of her alleged practices. This particular embellishment appears to have emerged much later, gaining traction and widespread popularity in the 18th century, and was further elaborated and romanticized in the 19th century, notably within the Gothic literary tradition. It subsequently became a cornerstone of the infamous Blood Countess persona, overshadowing the actual historical allegations. While the extant historical records detail a horrifying pattern of alleged tortures and murders, it is imperative to distinguish between these documented cruelties and the later, often fantastical, additions that have become deeply embedded in her popular image. The historically grounded narrative, devoid of such fictional elements, is inherently disturbing enough without the need for supernatural or exaggerated embellishments. The case of Elizabeth Báthory stands as a stark and compelling illustration of the intricate power dynamics that characterized aristocratic society in 17th century Europe. Her story exposes a system where immense hereditary wealth, formidable political influence, and exalted noble status could effectively insulate individuals from the full application of the law that governed commoners. While the number of alleged victims was extensive and their suffering, by all accounts, profound, the ultimate judicial outcome for the alleged primary perpetrator was dictated less by the severity of the crimes themselves and more by her unassailable social standing. Báthory's confinement, a form of house arrest rather than a public trial and execution, represented a chilling form of accountability that implicitly prioritized the stability of the noble class over absolute justice for its victims. It serves as a haunting reminder of the historical limitations of judicial systems when confronted by overwhelming privilege, and the enduring importance of scrutinizing power and its potential for abuse. Her memory compels a re-examination not just of the accusations leveled against her, but of the deeply ingrained structural inequalities that allowed such extensive suffering to occur largely unchecked for years, and why, despite the terrible allegations, she ultimately eluded the full legal consequences that would have unequivocally befallen any person of lesser standing in that era.